On that particular Tuesday in late June, St. Mary Mead looked as though nothing truly dreadful could ever happen there. The sky was a mild, apologetic blue. The roses in the vicarage garden nodded with modest pride, and the white-painted chairs set out beneath the laburnum were already occupied by ladies who had long ago learned how to balance a teacup, a saucer, and a slice of cake while maintaining an air of gentle disapproval of almost everything. The church restoration fete was in full swing. There was a stall for homemade jams and jellies, a stall for needlework, a stall for books, and a stall for what the vicar's wife, with a certain boldness, had labeled treasures and curios, though most of the treasures appeared to be chipped vases and decidedly unfashionable china dogs. Children darted about with that alarming swiftness only children possess. The vicar perspired nobly in his cassock, and Colonel Melchett, chief constable of the county, had been inveigled into drawing the raffle later in the afternoon, a duty he accepted with the air of a man accustomed to facing much worse things in the war. Miss Jane Marple sat somewhat apart from the bustle, her favorite position. From a wicker chair under a venerable yew, she commanded an excellent view of all comings and goings. Her knitting, something in grey wool that might, in time, become a cardigan for a great-niece, clicked in her small, capable hands. Her eyes, very blue and very shrewd, moved from group to group, to Mrs. Price Ridley at the jam store, brisk and managing, to young Diana Brent, the schoolmistress, laughing à quart d'heure, little too gaily, with the curate, to Mr. Lionel Jerome, the newcomer at Old Manor House, standing by the tea-urn and talking rather loudly. Mr. Jerome was, naturally, a subject of interest. A man from the city, which might mean anything from a respectable broker to something much less definite. Retired early, which always invited conjecture, and clearly a person of means, for Old Manor House required a good deal of money if one wished to live in it comfortably. He was large, florid, with an easy, confident manner, and a laugh that could be heard halfway across the lawn. He told amusing stories, which some people thought in slightly doubtful taste, and had a way of clapping men on the back and paying compliments to women that suggested he was determined to be popular. In a village like St. Mary Mead, that in itself was enough to make him suspect. "Mark my words," murmured Mrs. Price Ridley to Mrs. Weatherby, as they supervised the slicing of a sponge cake. "Men who talk that much about having no more worries and peaceful life in the country are generally the sort who have had quite a lot of worries, of the wrong kind. City men don't retire early for nothing." Miss Marple, catching only the tone and not the words, smiled to herself. She had known, in her time, several city gentlemen who had retired early, some for reasons more respectable than others. Human nature, she reflected, changed very little. Only the labels on it were altered. The warm afternoon drifted in an amiable haze. A piano was being coaxed into a sentimental tune in the drawing-room. A bat of uncertain age waited on the lawn for the children's cricket. Bees hummed in a deliberate way about the lavender. Everything suggested that life in St. Mary Mead would continue exactly as it always had, with small economies, small vanities, and small scandals that never quite ripened into anything very serious. It was precisely then that the scream came. It was not a loud scream. It was, a curious thing to notice, a tidy scream, brief, sharp, and neatly finished, cut off almost at once. It came from the direction of the side path that led round the house towards the lane, a path screened by evergreen shrubs and much favored by those who wished to arrive at the fete inconspicuously late or leave it inconspicuously early. Conversations broke off. Mrs. Clement, the vicar's wife, put down the teapot in a saucerful of spilled tea. Someone laughed uncertainly and said, "Good gracious, what was that?" A child began to cry, merely because something unusual had happened, and children are conservative by nature. Miss Marple rose, setting her knitting carefully in the wicker basket at her feet. She had heard too many screams in too many village gardens to dismiss this one as merely a lady surprised by a wasp. There is a quality in a cry that has nothing to do with volume and everything to do with fear. People were already moving towards the shrubbery. some hesitatingly, some with the eager curiosity of those who do not yet understand that unpleasant things, once seen, cannot easily be forgotten. Colonel Melchett strode ahead in his official manner, his jaw set. The vicar fluttered along behind him, and Mrs. Clement, torn between duty to her guests and duty to a possible casualty, finally lifted her skirts and ran. The path was narrow and shaded, the close, rather sour smell of box hedge heavy in the still air. It ended in a small gravelled space near the side gate, half hidden from the garden by the overhanging laurel. There, on the gravel, lay a woman. She was perhaps in her 30s, well dressed in town fashion, a pale linen suit, good shoes, a small chic hat that had fallen askew. Beside her was a leather handbag of excellent quality, its clasp shut, its surface unscratched. Her eyes were open, staring at the dull green leaves above her. Her hands were flung out, palms slightly upward, in a gesture that was disagreeable in its unnatural stillness. "She's fainted," said Mrs. Clement, with an air of deciding the matter. "The heat, no doubt. We must get her into the house at once. Colonel—" But Miss Marple, who had come up quietly and now stood a little to one side, was looking not at the woman's face, nor at her hands, nor at the neatness of her clothes. She was looking with that mild, absorbed attention which her friends had learned to regard with some respect, at the thin silk scarf knotted around the woman's throat. It was twisted rather tightly. A small sound broke the silence, the soft, uncertain mew of a cat. From behind the laurel bush, a plump tabby emerged, tail low, eyes wide, stepping delicately as though the gravel itself might be dangerous. It uttered another plaintive meow, looked up at the motionless figure on the ground, and then at Miss Marple. Miss Marple, noticing the cat, tilted her head very slightly. In St. Mary Mead, even a cat's meow could mean something, if one only listened to it in the right way. People began drifting toward the potting shed in hesitant little clusters, drawn by the cat's terrible wail, yet reluctant to be the first to confront whatever it might portend. Tobias had planted himself squarely before the half-open door, fur bushed, tail lashing in agitated arcs. Each long, penetrating yowl seemed to vibrate in the still summer air. "Come along, Dolly," Mrs. Bantry said, rising with reluctant curiosity. "We'd better see what all this fuss is about." She gathered up her handbag as though it were a shield and looked expectantly at Miss Marple. Miss Marple, however, did not immediately move. She observed the small procession forming, Dorothy pale and wide-eyed, Arthur striding a little too quickly as though to prove his courage, Colonel Melchett marching back across the lawn with exasperated authority, and, a little behind, Mr. Geoffrey Ashford with that peculiar mixture of reluctance and curiosity which so often marked the guilty and the innocent alike. "Do come, Jane," urged Mrs. Bantry. "You can't possibly sit there knitting when that cat sounds like the trump of doom." Miss Marple rose, her joints protesting only slightly. "Oh, I think we must certainly go," she agreed mildly. "If there is nothing, everyone will be relieved. And if there is something, well, it is much better to know, is it not?" They followed the others over the neatly rolled lawn, past the tombola stall and the flower arrangements, toward the quieter corner of the vicarage garden where the old brick potting shed stood amidst a tangle of roses and overgrown lavender. The shed door hung slightly askew on its hinges, the wood darkened by years of weather and use. It was Colonel Melchett who reached the door first. "Now then," he said gruffly, more to the assembled onlookers than to the cat. "Stand back, all of you. No need for a crowding mob." Tobias did not move aside until Miss Marple, with a soft clucking sound, stooped to stroke his head. "Poor Tobias," she murmured. "He has seen something that troubles him very much. Animals do so dislike untidiness, you know, particularly the untidiness of sudden death." Several people glanced at her in startled alarm, but before anyone could comment, Colonel Melchett pushed the door fully open. A musty smell of earth and fertilizer drifted out, mingled with something sharper and metallic that Miss Marple recognized with a quiet, inward acknowledgement. There was a brief, suspended hush, like the intake of a collective breath. Then a woman screamed. Lying on the hard-packed earth floor, amidst scattered pots and a broken trowel, was the body of Mrs. Geoffrey Ashford. Her blue silk scarf was twisted tightly around her throat, her eyes staring glassily at the spider-webbed roof. One elegant hand still clutched at the scarf as if in belated protest. A clay pot lay shattered beside her, soil spilling like dark crumbs around her head. For a moment, no one moved. The tableau of the fate beyond, the bunting, the stalls, the neatly dressed villagers, seemed outrageously incongruous with the violence in the dim little shed. It was Dorothy who broke the spell, her voice thin and reedy. "Aunt Mildred, the doctor, someone fetch Dr. Haydock, please." Arthur Penhaligon sprang into action, glad of instruction. "I'll go," he called, and pushed through the crowd, nearly colliding with Mr. Ashford, who stood frozen, staring at his wife's body with an expression that was difficult to read. Shock, certainly, but something else as well. Calculation. Relief? Miss Marple, watching him closely, tucked the impression away without comment. Colonel Melchett stepped inside, his boots crunching on broken pottery. "Nobody else in here, if you please," he said with brusque efficiency. "We mustn't have everything trampled over. Miss Marple, Mrs. Bantry, take the ladies away. There's good people." Miss Marple did not immediately obey. Her gaze traveled slowly around the small space. The overturned stool, a pair of leather gardening gloves lying beneath the potting bench, a smear of soil on the doorframe at the level of a man's shoulder, and caught against a rough splinter of wood near the latch, a single auburn hair that glinted faintly in the half-light. Outside, the cat had stopped yowling and now sat, tail curled neatly around his paws, watching solemnly as though his duty were done. "It looks like strangulation, Mrs. Bantry whispered, her voice shaking. "Oh, Jane, how dreadful! And on Fate Day, too." "Violence is seldom considerate of our social arrangements," Miss Marple replied quietly. "Poor woman." Her eyes softened for a moment as they rested on the dead face. "She was not happy, I think. Unhappiness can pull many threads together in unfortunate ways." Geoffrey Ashford suddenly seemed to come alive. He pushed past Dorothy and Mrs. Bantry, heedless of Colonel Melchett's protest. "Clara!" he cried, using his wife's name for perhaps the first time in public memory. "Clara, my God, what's happened to you?" No one answered. The question, Miss Marple thought, was not so much what had happened as who had made it happen, and why. Dr. Haydock arrived at last, out of breath and irritable, his spectacles misted with exertion. He knelt beside the body, his practiced hands moving efficiently here and there. "Quite dead," he announced eventually, straightening with a sigh. "Has been for some time, I should say, an hour at least, perhaps more." His sharp eyes traveled to the colonel. "You'll want to inform the police, Melchett." "I am the police," the colonel retorted, "and I'm informing myself that this is murder." The word, spoken aloud, seemed to settle over the garden like a dark cloud. Somewhere beyond the hedge, the village band struck up a cheerful tune, quite unaware. Miss Marple, gently stroking Tobias's head, listened to the rising murmurs around her. People were already beginning to talk, to speculate, to remember small slights and curious looks. Gossip, she knew, was merely the raw material of truth, misarranged. Her eyes moved thoughtfully from Geoffrey Ashford's stricken face, to Dorothy's trembling hands, to Arthur's returning figure in the distance, then to Colonel Melchett standing, squarely in the doorway of the shed like a vigilant sentry. Murder in St. Mary Mead never rested on a single motive. It was usually a tapestry of grudges, fires, and small human weaknesses. Somewhere in that tapestry, she thought, a single loose thread would be waiting to be tugged. And very often it was something as small and overlooked as a frightened cat's distressed meow that pointed the way. Inspector Slack arrived with his usual air of barely concealed impatience, his boots crunching on the gravel path as Constable Polk hurried at his heels. The fate had thinned now. While no one had been permitted to leave, people had drifted into small, excited clusters, murmuring urgently, their eyes flitting between the potting shed and the imposing figure of Geoffrey Ashford. Slack took in the scene at a glance. The open shed, the body within, Colonel Melchett standing rigidly nearby, and Dr. T. Haydock closing his bag with a decisive snap. He set his jaw in the manner of a man who had been dragged from a late Sunday lunch and expected something wholly inconvenient, and now found himself entirely justified. "Well, Colonel," he said briskly, "what have we got here then?" "Mrs. Ashford," Melchett replied, his tone grave. "Strangled. Haydock says at least an hour dead. Found here in the potting shed a quarter of an hour ago. The fate was in full swing all the while." Inspector Slack stepped into the shed, squinting slightly as his eyes adjusted to the dimmer light. He examined the scarf, the twisted limbs, the scattered pots. He was not an imaginative man, but he was thorough. "No sign of forced entry," he muttered. "Nothing taken by the look of it, so we can rule out burglary gone wrong." Miss Marple, still calmly knitting, watched from her vantage point as the first ripples of speculation spread among the villagers. Mrs. Price Ridley, always eager for scandal, whispered loudly to Mrs. Hartnell, "Mark my words, it's something to do with that dreadful housing scheme. You heard the Colonel? Over my dead body," he said. Well, it seems it was hers instead. Across the lawn, Miss Marple noticed Mrs. Ashford's maid, a thin, mousy girl named Ellen, standing alone by the lemonade store. Her eyes were red-rimmed, certainly, but there was a curious absence of shock in her demeanor. Resignation, rather, as if some private dread had finally materialized in the precise form she had long anticipated. Inspector Slack emerged from the shed and turned to the waiting faces. "Right," he began, in the tone of a schoolmaster about to set order to a rowdy classroom. "Nobody is to leave until they've given their name and address to Constable Polk. We shall need statements from everyone who was at the fete this afternoon. That includes you, Miss Marple," he added with a faint edge, as if preemptively warding off interference. "But of course, Inspector," Miss Marple responded mildly. "I am sure we all wish to be of help." Geoffrey Ashford, who had remained curiously silent until now, stepped forward, his face a mask of controlled anguish. "Inspector," he said, his voice tight, "I demand that you find who did this. Clara had no enemies, none that mattered. She was—" He stopped, swallowing hard. Miss Marple caught the slip. "None that mattered." It was an odd choice of words for a grieving husband. "Naturally, Mr. Ashford," Slack replied. "We shall do everything in our power. Now, when did you last see your wife alive?" Ashford hesitated almost imperceptibly. "Just after the fete began. She said she wanted some air. I assume she went to walk in the gardens. She wasn't fond of crowds." Miss Marple distinctly remembered seeing Mrs. T.'s Ashford walking purposefully toward the potting shed not long before Tobias's frantic yowls. That had not been just after the fete began. Either Mr. Ashford's memory was unreliable, or something else was at work. Dorothy Fletcher, still standing with Arthur Penhaligon, twisted her handkerchief into a tight, ringing mass. Her eyes were fixed on Geoffrey Ashford with what looked very much like guilt. Arthur murmured something to her, but his own gaze darted nervously toward the lane that led away from the vicarage, as though measuring the distance. "Anyone see Mrs. Ashford go toward the shed?" Slack demanded, sweeping the assembled group with a sharp look. There was a murmur of uncertainty. People looked at one another, everyone wanting to be helpful, yet no one wishing to put their head above the parapet. "I believe I may have done so, Inspector," Miss Marple said, her tone apologetic, as though confessing to some small cruel oversight, a little while before Tobias began to cry out. She was walking quite quickly, and her scarf was blowing in the wind. "Such a pretty blue." Slack grunted. "And did you see anyone else near the shed at the time, Miss Marple?" She shook her head. "No one in particular. But then, my eyes are not what they once were. One can't always be certain at my age." Colonel Melchett frowned. "Plenty of people had cause to dislike Geoffrey's plans," he muttered. "But Clara, she was scarcely involved." "Sometimes," Miss Marple said softly. Resentment has a way of attaching itself to those who are closest at hand, even if they are not the real source of the grievance. A lightning rod, so to speak. Her remark set off another wave of speculation. Mrs. Price. Ridley immediately began to speak of Clara's supposed flirtations, murmurs of a London admirer, hushed conversations on the telephone when her husband was absent. It was striking how quickly a dead woman could be reimagined as dangerous, even by those who had smiled at her that very morning. Inspector Slack, notebook in hand, moved from group to group, taking preliminary statements. Miss Marple, though outwardly passive, listened keenly. Arthur insisted he had been helping at the coconut shy for most of the afternoon, though Miss Marple remembered seeing him standing alone, checking his watch. Dorothy claimed to have been continuously at the tea table, though her frequent anxious glances elsewhere suggested a divided attention. Ellen, the maid, said she had been in the background, fetching and carrying as instructed. Her favorite place, Miss Marple suspected, for one who preferred to see rather than be seen. The village, so recently unified in its enjoyment of the fete, now fractured into a dozen theories. Some were convinced the murder must be connected to the housing development. Others whispered of jealousy, blackmail, or some shadowy past from which Mrs. Ashford had never quite escaped. Each person, it seemed, projected their own fears and experiences onto the tragedy, shaping it into a story that made sense to them. Miss Marple knew better than to accept any of these narratives at face value. Human beings, she often reflected, were remarkably similar to the plants in her garden. They put forth one set of leaves to the world, while an entirely different system of roots and shoots thrived unseen below the surface. It was the hidden parts that did most of the real work and caused most of the trouble. Tobias, having resumed his calm, jumped lightly onto the low wall by the shed and began to wash his paws with elaborate care, as though distancing himself from the human uproar he had inadvertently initiated. His earlier distress was gone now. His conscience was apparently clear. It is very curious, Miss Marple thought, her needles slowing for a moment. Why should a cat cry out like that, for a body that had been lying there for an hour? What changed just then to disturb him so? The answer, she knew, would lie not in physical evidence, but in human behavior, the small, telling inconsistencies that revealed more than any fingerprint ever could. By early evening, the fete had been abandoned in a state of half-dismantled disarray. The bunting drooped sadly, the cake stall stood deserted with only crumbs and smeared jam remaining, and overturned decker chairs littered the lawn like casualties on a battlefield. The vicar had insisted that everyone remain available for questioning, so small knots of villagers lingered uneasily in the fading light, speaking in hushed tones that broke off whenever Inspector Slack drew near. Miss Marple, having given her own concise statement, had retreated to a modest bench beneath the yew hedge, where Tobias the cat had installed himself beside her with proprietary confidence. Inspector Slack, clipboard in hand, had set up an impromptu interviewing station at a trestle table near the main marquee. One by one, the villagers were called forward. Miss Marple watched as Geoffrey Ashford took the vacant chair opposite the inspector, his movements stiff, like a man rehearsing for a part he had not learned properly. Even from a distance, his voice carried in occasional sharp fragments. Ridiculous. Of course I was seen. Development has nothing to do with this. His hands moved restlessly on the tabletop, fingers worrying at a cufflink until it nearly came loose. Behind him, Mrs. Price Ridley and Mrs. Hartnell exchanged meaningful glances, silently confirming one another's conviction that the husband was, naturally, the proper person to suspect. It was only when Ellen the maid was summoned that Miss Marple's attention sharpened decisively. The girl advanced as if walking into a storm, shoulders hunched, eyes downcast. Slack's tone, for once, became almost gentle. "Now then, Miss Ellen, isn't it? You were in service at the Ashfords?" A tiny nod. "You'd know their ways, what they argued about, if they argued." There was a tremor in Ellen's reply. They had words, sir. Often. Mr. Ashford. He wanted money, always money. Mrs. Ashford, she liked to make him wait. She swallowed. She said a man ought to be kept hungry. That was her phrase. Ellen's trembling hands twisted the hem of her apron. Yesterday they quarreled very bad. About some papers. She locked them in her desk and took the key with her. Miss Marple stored away that detail with the others. Money, papers, a key. Such things rarely appeared in a story without purpose. Slack pounced immediately. Papers? What sort of papers? Ellen shook her head helplessly. I don't know, sir. I only heard Mr. Ashford say, "You're playing a dangerous game, Clara. You can't hold this over me forever." And she laughed. The inspector's pencil scratched busily. To most observers, this seemed to clinch the matter. Quarrels, money, threats. Yet Miss Marple's expression remained thoughtful, rather than satisfied. Husbands who killed their wives, she reflected, were often less careless in their displays of temper beforehand. There had been, in Mr. Ashford's alarm, something of genuine bewilderment rather than guilt. Not innocence necessarily, but not quite the neat villainy the village so readily assigned him. Arthur Penhaligon's turn came next. He sat tensely, back very straight, as though sheer posture might supply the honesty his words lacked. He repeated the tale about helping at the coconut shy, adding a few unnecessary details about the number of prizes won and the sturdiness of the apparatus. Such embroidery invariably interested Miss Marple. When people were truthful, they tended to be simpler. Slack, however, seemed content so long as Arthur's account could be roughly corroborated, and several boys from the village were eager to confirm that Mr. Arthur had indeed been nearby at intervals. It was not the same thing as a continuous alibi, but the inspector appeared satisfied to pencil in the young man under unlikely. Dorothy Fletcher followed. Her statement was brief, almost evasive. She had been at the tea urn, she declared repeatedly, save for 2 short visits to the kitchen to fetch more cups. She had not seen Mrs. Ashford go to the shed, nor heard anything unusual above the general noise of the fete. The faint flush on her cheeks, the way her eyes avoided Arthur's rigid back, told a different story, at least to Miss Marple's experienced eye. Dorothy was quite plainly frightened, though whether of the murderer, the police, or her own conscience remained to be seen. When the formalities had concluded and dusk was creeping in from the edges of the lawn, the vicar insisted everyone come indoors for tea and sandwiches. It was a typically English response to tragedy, Miss Marple thought, with quiet amusement and a certain respect. People spoke more freely with a teacup in hand. In the crowded drawing room, conversation rose and fell like the tide. The colonel loudly advanced the theory that Ashford had lured his wife to the shed to make one last demand. Then lost his temper. Mrs. Bantry, though not defending the man precisely, pointed out that strangling one's wife during a village fete showed a regrettable lack of foresight. Haydock, between bites of ham sandwich, observed that if the killer had hoped to pass the death off as an accident, choosing a silk scarf as a garrote suggested someone who knew very little about accidents. Miss Marple, seated near the fireplace with Tobias curled like a furry apostrophe at her feet, listened more than she spoke. Every now and then she ventured one of her mild, apparently inconsequential remarks. "Of course, people do the strangest things when they feel cornered," she said at one point. "I remember a case in St. Mary Mead where a certain lady hid her employer's jewelry in a box of mothballs and then quite forgot where she'd put them when the police came. Poor soul, she all but accused herself by her very agitation." Those who knew her well, like Mrs. Bantry and Dr. Haydock, exchanged brief glances. They understood that such anecdotes were never as random as they sounded. Later, as the guests began to drift away under Inspector Slack's reluctant permission, Miss Marple lingered in the vicarage hall, ostensibly adjusting her shawl. She watched Ellen slip quietly from the kitchen toward the back door, pausing only to glance nervously over her shoulder. Tobias, for reasons of his own, chose that moment to rise, stretch, and trot after the maid, his tail held like a banner. Miss Marple's eyes followed the cat with interest. Tobias, after all, had been the first to announce death that afternoon. Animals might not understand murder, but they understood disturbance, and they had very decided tastes in human company. Cats, Miss Marple murmured, as if to herself, so very particular about who they like and who they don't. They notice little things. And as the vicarage door closed softly behind Ellen and her feline shadow, Miss Marple felt the faint, familiar stirrings of pattern forming. Threads of money and fear, secrecy, winding inexorably back to a quiet potting shed and a blue silk scarf fluttering in the June breeze. The following morning dawned with deceptive serenity. Sunlight filtered through lace curtains, birds trilled industriously in hedgerows, and the milk cart rattled along the lane as if murder had not disturbed the village's tranquil existence. Yet beneath the habitual routines of St. Mary Mead, something taut and uneasy vibrated, like a violin string tuned just a fraction too tightly. At the Blue Boar, where the morning coffee crowd had replaced the usual beer drinkers, discussion of the crime had attained the feverish intensity of a parish council scandal, multiplied tenfold. Mrs. Price Ridley, installed at the central table like a reigning monarch, addressed her audience with solemn relish. "It is practically an open and shut case," she declared, stirring sugar into her coffee with unnecessary vigor. The man was in debt up to his ears, entirely dependent upon his wife's fortune, and furious with her refusal to fund his dreadful development scheme. Anyone with eyes could see she had begun to despise him. Financial motive, opportunity, marital discord, what more do the police require? Proof, perhaps, murmured Mr. Clement, the vicar, who had come in search of a quiet cup of tea and instead found himself conscripted into the role of reluctant theologian to the court of public opinion. The law does tend to insist on that. Proof, sniffed Mrs. Price Ridley, is simply a matter of time. Why, if he hadn't done it, who on earth would have? She cast a sweeping glance around the tap room, daring anyone to present an alternative. At that precise moment, Miss Marple entered, her neat figure framed by the sunlight from the open door. She acknowledged the room with a gentle nod, as though stepping into a drawing room rather than a cauldron of speculation. Tobias the cat, who had taken to following her of late with the determined affection of those who recognize a kindred spirit, slipped in behind her and settled beneath a corner chair with grave dignity. "We were just saying," Mrs. Price Ridley announced, as if Miss Marple's arrival had been by formal summons. "How obvious the whole matter appears. I dare say Inspector Slack will have it all wrapped up by the weekend." Miss Marple seated herself carefully. "Oh dear," she said mildly, removing her gloves. "I always feel a little nervous when things appear obvious. In my experience, life is rarely so obliging." There was a faint, almost imperceptible stir among her listeners. Though many of them considered Miss Marple a slightly dotty old lady, they also, however grudgingly, remembered that troublesome pattern of her being right at precisely those times, when everyone else was quite sure they had the answer. "What do you mean, Miss Marple?" asked the vicar, more interested than his casual tour suggested. She picked up her knitting, the soft click of needles forming a gentle counterpoint to her thoughts. "Why, only that human beings are such curious creatures. They seldom do precisely what one expects, and when they do, it is often for reasons entirely different from those we assume. It is ever so dangerous, I have found, to decide too quickly who must be guilty, merely because it would tidy things up nicely." "But you must admit," persisted Mrs. Price Ridley, "Mr. Ashford had every reason to wish his wife dead." "Oh, certainly," Miss Marple agreed placidly. "But so, it seems, did a surprising number of other people. That is what troubles me. When too many motives cluster around one corpse, it becomes difficult to see which is the genuine article." She paused, her eyes drifting to the window as if idly admiring the geraniums on the sill. "For instance," she continued, "there is young Arthur Penhaligon. A nice boy, of course, but quite evidently under strain. And Dorothy Fletcher, such a dutiful girl, yet looking lately as if she had seen a ghost she dare not mention. Then there is Ellen, poor child, who behaves as though some dreadful inevitability has simply come to pass. Mr. Clement frowned thoughtfully. You think one of them? I think, Miss Marple interrupted gently, that something was set in motion long before yesterday's fate, and that what happened in the potting shed may have been the result of several different schemes colliding in a most unfortunate manner. That afternoon, with the village still humming like an overturned beehive, Miss Marple took a deliberate stroll along the vicarage path under the pretext of bringing Mrs. Clement a jar of her special raspberry jam. She found Dorothy alone in the kitchen, stacking cups with unnecessary precision. You must be quite worn out, my dear, after all the excitement, Miss Marple observed mildly. Village fetes are tiring enough even without murders. Dorothy's hands stilled. It was horrible, she said faintly. I keep seeing her lying there. Quite natural, Miss Marple assured her. Though I dare say what troubles you more is not what you saw, but what you heard beforehand. The girl's eyes flew to Miss Marple's face, then quickly away. I don't know what you mean. Young men, Miss Marple said, as if discussing the weather, are terribly prone to melodrama when they feel cornered. They say all manner of foolish things, particularly when they believe they have been wronged. Threats about something having to be done and lives being unbearable and such. I expect Arthur has been saying quite a lot of that sort of thing lately. Dorothy's fingers tightened around a teacup until the delicate china trembled. Arthur is unhappy, that's all. He didn't mean he could never. My dear, Miss Marple interrupted gently. I have not suggested that he did anything. Only that one must be very careful in such matters. Words spoken in anger can sound very ugly indeed when repeated in a police station. Dorothy swallowed. He was only talking, she whispered. He was angry with Mrs. Ashford, that's true. She promised to help him once, to speak to someone she knew about a position. Then she changed her mind. She laughed at him, said he was too soft, that men like him were only useful if they had money, or could get it. Ah, Miss Marple murmured. She seems to have had a talent for making herself disliked. Dorothy glanced around to ensure they were quite alone. Arthur swore he'd make her sorry, that she'd regret crossing him, but it was just talk, Miss Marple, truly. When he went to the shed yesterday, she was already... She broke off, shuddering. So he did go to the shed? Miss Marple asked softly, though she had been quite certain of it already. Even though he'd told Inspector Slack he had not left the coconut shy? Dorothy nodded miserably. He had a note, she confessed, asking him to meet her there at 2 o'clock. He said she'd changed her mind, that she might be willing to help him after all. A note, Miss Marple repeated. How very interesting. Mr. Ashford also received such a note, one asking him to come at 2:15. Dorothy stared at her. But then, who wrote them? That, my dear, Miss Marple said, rising with a small, decisive movement, is precisely what we must find out. On her way back along the gravel path, Tobias slipped out from between the shrubs and fell into step beside her. The cat paused near the potting shed and let out a single, oddly measured meow, not distressed this time, but insistently questioning. Miss Marple's eyes followed his gaze to the shed door, where the faintest trace of a boot mark remained in the dust. A smaller, narrower shape than Geoffrey Ashford's broadier, fashionable shoes. Clever creature, she murmured. You do see things people miss, don't you? A second note, a second secret appointment, and a footprint that did not belong to the obvious suspect. These were not the trappings of a simple crime. The pattern emerging was far more intricate, and Miss Marple, with quiet satisfaction, began to see the shape it might yet take. The next morning dawned grey and close, as if the sky itself shared in the village's unease. News of Geoffrey Ashford's arrest had spread like spilled ink. Even the milkmen lingered on doorsteps to exchange theories. Yet at the vicarage breakfast table, where Miss Marple had been invited to stay the night for convenience, conversation was notably subdued. The vicar, Mr. Clement, pushed aside his bacon with a sigh. I suppose we must be grateful it's all so swiftly resolved, he said. though his tone lacked conviction. Geoffrey Ashford in custody, Dr. Haydock's report, Ellen's notebook. It does rather all point in one direction. Miss Marple buttered her toast with careful consideration. It points, she agreed mildly, but not always where one expects. I have often noticed, Mr. Clement, that when many small facts seem to agree too neatly, one should examine not only what is present, but what is absent. Dorothy, pale and hollow-eyed, looked up quickly. Absent, Miss Marple? For instance, Miss Marple continued, in cases of domestic jealousy, one usually hears of raised voices through thin walls, of smashed crockery, of confidences to servants. Yet poor Ellen described quarrels that were quite businesslike. Papers, money, conditions. Very unlike the passionate scenes in the penny novelettes, don't you think? Arthur Penhaligon, seated across from Dorothy, shifted uneasily. His confession to Miss Marple the previous evening had been followed by a long, uncomfortable interview with Inspector Slack. Miss Marple had only fragments of its content. But the inspector's cool politeness at the breakfast-time telephone call suggested he now viewed Arthur as an accessory at worst, a frightened pawn at best. Inspector Slack says he will be calling presently, Mr. Clement added, folding the morning paper. He wishes to speak with you, Miss Marple. It appears your observations have caused him to revise certain assumptions. Dear me, Miss Marple replied in a tone of mild regret. I do hope I haven't made too much trouble. Men so dislike having their assumptions revised. She had barely finished her tea when Inspector Slack arrived, brisk and frowning, his notebook already in hand. Tobias the cat preceded him into the sitting room, tail held high, as though escorting the official party on his own authority. He leapt lightly onto Miss Marple's lap and settled there with proprietary satisfaction. Now then, Miss Marple, Slack began without preamble. Young Penhaligon's story tallies with some of our findings. He admits supplying Mrs. Ashford with a sedative mixture, legally obtained, mind you, through a London contact, for what she described as self-protection. Claims she said it would only be used if she felt threatened. That agrees with the faint medicinal traces Haydock found. Doesn't, however, explain who actually put their hands on that scarf. No, Miss Marple agreed, stroking Tobias thoughtfully. But it does suggest that Mrs. Ashford expected a confrontation where she might feel at a disadvantage. One rarely arms oneself unless one anticipates an enemy. Slack grunted. She was planning to confront her husband. That's obvious enough. Possibly, Miss Marple said, but Ellen's account of the note she received mentioned settling matters permanently at 2 o'clock. We now know Geoffrey's supposed note summoned him for 1:15. That discrepancy troubles me greatly, Inspector. If she meant to confront her husband, why arrange 2 different times? Slack flipped through his notes. Perhaps she changed her mind. Perhaps she wrote the second note later, and kept the first a secret from her maid. Clara Ashford does not strike me as a woman who often changed her mind about such matters. No, I think she intended 2 meetings, one at 2 o'clock, one at 1:15. The first to settle matters, the second perhaps to confirm the results. Slack hesitated, unwilling but compelled. And you believe the first meeting was with whom? Miss Marple's gaze traveled, apparently idly, toward Dorothy, who had entered with a tray and was now standing very still by the doorway. Mrs. Ashford's notebook provides some interesting candidates. Young Arthur, of course. Ellen, even Mrs. Bantry, though I suspect that entry is merely a matter of some unfortunate gambling debt at bridge. But there is one person in this house whose name appears twice, underlined, with amounts beside it. Dorothy's hand trembled. The teacups rattled faintly. You've read it? She whispered. Miss Marple nodded gently. Ellen brought it to me before handing it over to Inspector Slack. I glanced, only briefly, of course, but one cannot help noticing certain patterns. DF, for instance, appears beside 2 dates and 2 rather modest sums. Hardly the reckless extravagance of London, but quite substantial for a vicar's niece with no independent income. Dorothy set down the tray with exaggerated care. She said she would help Arthur, she blurted suddenly. the words tumbling out. She said with her London connections, she could get his records altered, the worst of it erased. All she wanted was a little money at first, then more, always more. When I couldn't pay, she hinted she might speak to Uncle Clement. She knew he'd send Arthur away. Again. Arthur half rose from his chair. "Dorothy, don't," Miss Marple's voice, though soft, cut neatly through the room. "My dear, you have already said enough to show that Clara Ashford had a very profitable sideline in blackmail. And blackmail, as I have observed more than once, is an occupation with a notoriously high mortality rate." Inspector Slack snapped his notebook shut. "So Miss Fletcher had a motive. Many did. But motive isn't proof. Where were you at 2 o'clock, Miss Dorothy?" Dorothy swallowed. "At the tea tent. All the ladies saw me." "Not quite all the time," Miss Marple remarked apologetically. "I recall a gap of some minutes when your cousin, Mrs. Price Ridley, remarked that you had gone to fetch more sugar. She was rather put out that her second cup of tea was delayed." Dorothy's eyes filled with sudden, desperate tears. "I didn't kill her," she whispered. "I went to meet her, yes, behind the shed, where she told me to come if I didn't want Arthur ruined. She said if I brought what little money I had, she might give me more time. But when I arrived, she wasn't there. I waited. Then I heard voices at the front of the shed and slipped away. That's all." "Voices," Miss Marple repeated quietly. "Plural, yes. A woman's voice, sharp and angry. Not Clara's, though. Older, and a man's, low, trying to calm her. I didn't want to be seen listening, so I ran back to the tent." Slack's eyes narrowed. "Could you recognize either voice?" Dorothy hesitated. "The woman sounded like someone trying very hard not to lose control. Refined, but brittle. I've heard that tone before. At committee meetings, when things get difficult." Miss Marple's mind sifted through her catalogue of village tempers, Mrs. Price Ridley's bluster, Mrs. Bantry's amiable exasperation, Ellen's fearful stammer. Brittle restraint, that belonged elsewhere. "Inspector," she said slowly, "I think it might be useful to know who else received notes from Mrs. Ashford recently. In particular, any ladies involved with village committees, charitable funds, or land matters." Slack frowned. "You believe the blackmail reached higher than a few frightened youngsters?" "I should be very surprised if it didn't," Miss Marple replied. Clara Ashford understood weakness and money. She would not have limited herself to small game when there were larger birds in the same field. Tobias stretched luxuriously across her lap at that moment and let out a sharp, oddly timed meow, as if endorsing this line of thought. Miss Marple's fingers paused in his fur. She remembered him again at the potting shed, crying to attract attention, yet never crossing the threshold, circling, sniffing at one particular corner before beginning his alarm. "The cat," she murmured. "Inspector, has anyone considered why Tobias cried where he did and not inside?" Slack stared. "Because he's a cat, Miss Marple." "Because," she corrected gently, "something about the outside of that shed disturbed him first. Something, or someone, there before the door was ever opened. I think if we look carefully, we may find the first meeting left more traces than we realized. And if we learn whose voices Dorothy heard, the case against Geoffrey Ashford may begin to look rather less convenient than it does at present." By late afternoon, the village had settled into a tense, waiting stillness. Curtains twitched as Inspector Slack moved between the vicarage, the Ashford house, and Dr. Terr. Haydock's surgery, piecing together what he insisted on calling a coherent narrative. Miss Marple suspected the narrative was becoming rather less coherent with each new discovery. She chose, with typical unobtrusiveness, to pay a call on Mrs. Price Ridley. In St. Mary Mead, information flowed along established channels, and Mrs. Price Ridley was both a reservoir and a conduit. One did not need to interrogate her, merely to listen and sort the chaff from the grain. The formidable lady received Miss Marple in her stiffly upholstered drawing-room, where the antimacassars were straight and the opinions even straighter. Tobias, who had followed Miss Marple down the lane with feline persistence, slipped in before the maid could close the door and installed himself on the hearthrug with the air of one who had every right to be consulted. "I suppose you've come about this dreadful business," Mrs. Price Ridley began, her lips pursed into a beak of righteousness. "I said from the first nothing good would come of that woman. And now we see I was correct." "Oh, my dear, I'm sure you never wished anything so dreadful," Miss Marple replied mildly, settling her knitting in her lap. "Though it is extraordinary, is it not, how certain types of people seem to attract trouble?" Mrs. Price Ridley warmed to the theme at once. "Exactly, and she was a trouble-attracting sort if ever I saw one, always prying, always asking questions. Why, only last month she was at me about my investments. Wanted to know precisely how much I'd put into that railway scheme years ago. Said she was interested in local prosperity." "Huh. Did you happen to mention anyone else who'd invested?" Miss Marple asked, her needles beginning their gentle click. "Certainly not. I'm not in the habit of parading my private affairs. But she already knew about Colonel Melchett and Dr. Haydock and Monsieur Price." Ridley hesitated, savoring the importance of what she was about to reveal. "And poor Mrs. Bantry's little flutter years ago. Apparently, the Colonel's investment hadn't done as well as expected. Very bad-tempered about it," she said. "Of course, military men never like to lose battles, financial or otherwise." Miss Marple absorbed this with a small nod. Financial loss, shared among several prominent villagers, provided yet another fertile field for resentment. Coupled with Clara Ashford's systematic note-keeping, it created a web of obligations and grievances far wider than mere domestic strife. "And she asked the strangest questions," Mrs. Price Ridley continued, "wanting to know who'd lived in the village longest, who knew whom from before the war, that sort of thing. Very interested in old scandals, as if we had such things here." Miss Marple, who could have enumerated several, smiled faintly. "I suppose she was curious about people's pasts. One often finds, you know, that the past has a way of intruding into the present at the most inconvenient moments." Tobias, who had been dozing, suddenly sat up and gave a sharp, questioning meow, his ears pricked toward the open window that overlooked the lane. A moment later, footsteps crunched on the gravel outside, followed by the murmur of low voices. Miss Marple recognized Inspector Slack's brusque tones and Dr. T. Haydock's deeper, more measured replies. "I believe they're on their way to the Ashford house," Mrs. Price Ridley said, rising to peer through the lace curtains with unembarrassed curiosity. "No doubt to look for more of those pharmaceuticals you mentioned." Miss Marple lathered herself up with a little more agility than her age suggested. "Then perhaps, if you will excuse me, I might stroll that way. Fresh air, you know, so very important at my time of life." She left amid polite protestations and walked slowly toward the Blackwood estate, Tobias padding at her heels. The cat's presence had acquired, in Miss Marple's mind, a certain symbolic weight. Animals, after all, responded instinctively to character, and Tobias had shown distinct preferences in the past that had proved remarkably accurate. At the Ashford house, she found Ellen on the front step, wringing her hands as Inspector Slack and Dr. Haydock disappeared inside. The maid's eyes were red from crying, but there was also a hard, wary cast to her expression that suggested she knew more than she wished to share. "They're going through everything," Ellen whispered. "Mrs. Ashford's drawers, her desk, even the medicine cupboard. I never thought I'd see the day. People are often tidier after they die than while they are alive," Miss Marple observed gently. "Things come out of cupboards, drawers are emptied, letters are read. It can be very inconvenient for the living." Ellen looked at her sharply. "You're saying someone's afraid of what they'll find." "Aren't you, my dear?" The girl's composure cracked. "She kept copies, you see, of letters, receipts. And she wrote things down, not just what people did, but what they were afraid of. She said fear was the best guarantee of loyalty. I hated it, Miss Marple. Hated being part of it, but where was I to go? I've no people left, no references if she dismissed me." Tobias left Miss Marple's side and trotted up the steps, slipping past Ellen's ankles into the dim hallway. A moment later came his now familiar, urgent cry. Not distressed as it had been at the shed, but sharp, insistent, as if drawing attention to something specific. Inside, they found the cat perched on a small table beneath the staircase, his paw resting possessively on a leather dispatch case. The flap was buckled shut but badly worn, with fresh scratches around the clasp, as though someone had recently tried, and failed, to open it in haste. Haydock straightened from the linen cupboard he had been examining. Well, well, your feline friend seems to have ideas about the investigation, Miss Marple. Inspector Slack frowned at the dispatch case. Locked and no key in sight. Ellen, where did Mrs. Ashford keep this? In her bedroom, sir. She never let it out of her sight when she went up to town. Said it was her insurance. Insurance or ammunition, Miss Marple corrected gently. Slack sent Ellen to fetch the keys from the writing desk. When the correct one was finally located and the buckle forced, the contents spilled out across the hall table. Neatly banded packets of letters, typed copies of legal documents, and most strikingly, a series of envelopes labeled in Clara Ashford's careful hand. Dr. H. C. Melchett, D.F., A.P. And curiously, one marked only with a single initial. M. Inspector Slack's eyebrows rose. That's quite a collection she had. Looks like half the village is here. Miss Marple's attention, however, fixed on the solitary or initial. How curious, she murmured. In a village like ours, where one might easily confuse names, to label only by an initial. Unless, of course, it was so obvious to Mrs. Ashford that no further clarification was needed. She did not reach for the envelope. Instead, she watched carefully as Dr. T. Haydock's gaze lingered, just a fraction too long, on the one marked H, and as Ellen's eyes darted toward the D.F.'s packet with unmistakable dread. Guilt, Miss Marple knew, revealed itself in such tiny, telling hesitations. Someone here had not merely been threatened by Clara Ashford's knowledge, but had relied upon it, used it perhaps, as part of a larger design. The dispatch case, Tobias's insistent meow, the overlapping motives and pharmaceutical traces all pointed to a mind willing to weave other people's secrets into a weapon. It was not yet clear whose mind that was, but Miss Marple had the distinct feeling that, with the opening of that case, the murderer had just lost the most valuable piece in their carefully arranged game. The following day dawned with a faint mist lying low over the village, blurring edges and softening outlines, as though St. Mary Mead itself were reluctant to be seen too clearly. Miss Marple, however, had no such hesitation. She sat by her bedroom window with her early tea, reviewing in her mind the pattern of facts and impressions that had accumulated since the fate. What troubled her most was not the abundance of motives, those were plentiful, but the presence of something quite different, design. It was all too arranged, as though someone had calmly laid out the pieces of a jigsaw, certain that everyone else would see only the picture they were meant to see. After breakfast, she paid a call on Mrs. Bantry, ostensibly to return a borrowed book, but in reality to share her growing unease. They settled in the morning room, overlooking the garden, where Tobias had taken up a new vantage point on the low stone wall, watching the lane with that inscrutable feline concentration. "My dear Dolly," Miss Marple began, smoothing her skirt, "have you ever noticed how people who take up blackmail very seldom know when to stop? It is, I think, rather like pruning roses. One begins with the best of intentions, then snips a little more here, a little more there, until the plant is quite destroyed." Mrs. Bantry gave a small shudder. "Well, if you are suggesting Clara Ashford pruned too far, I should say that's beyond dispute. Half the village seems to have been under her thumb. No wonder someone snapped." "Yes," Miss Marple agreed, "but I'm not so much concerned with her as with the person who sharpened the shears." She opened the little leather notebook Ellen had given her, turning to a page marked only with initials and dates. They were meticulous entries, CM, HB, LC, all followed by sums and cryptic references. One set of initials appeared more frequently than any other. DF. "Dorothy Fletcher?" Mrs. Bantry asked, frowning. "But what on earth?" "That is precisely what I wondered," Miss Marple replied. Ellen mentioned that Mrs. Ashford had eyes and ears in unexpected places. Now Dorothy, as the vicar's niece, is in a position to hear a great many things that parishioners would rather keep private. Confessions might not be formally shared, of course, but people talk around matters, and young ears are very sharp when money and security are at stake. Mrs. Bantry looked genuinely stricken. "You don't mean Dorothy was helping Clara blackmail half the parish?" "I think at first she may have considered it guidance," Miss Marple said gently, encouraging Mrs. Ashford to nudge people into the paths she believed best, discouraging foolish investments, preventing unsuitable marriages, and so on. A very dangerous moral ground, that sort of thing. One can so easily slide from influence into coercion, especially when one feels one is acting for someone's own good. The conversation was interrupted by the arrival of Dorothy herself, shown in by the maid with an anxious little cough. The girl looked pale and strained, her usually neat hair slightly disordered, as if she had been running her hands through it in distress. "Miss Marple," she burst out, scarcely waiting to sit. "Inspector Slack has released Mr. Ashford for the moment, but he still thinks Arthur is involved. He says Arthur's sedative may have weakened Mrs. Ashford, making her easier to kill. He keeps talking about accessories and complicity. You must help us." Miss Marple regarded her kindly. "My dear child, I am doing my best, but I fear you have been less than candid, both with the inspector and with yourself. It is so much easier, is it not, to blame one person entirely, when in truth we have all helped create the conditions in which evil can flourish?" Dorothy's composure wavered. "I only wanted to protect Arthur," she whispered, "and Uncle Leonard, and others. Clara said she could help, that she could man people. It seemed sensible at first. If someone was about to do something foolish, why not steer them? But then she began asking for money and threatening. I tried to stop her. Truly I did." "By arranging to meet her at the potting shed?" Miss Marple asked gently. "At her own request, yes, but you hoped to reason with her. Only when you arrived, you heard voices already raised in anger. That disturbed you, because it was not Arthur's voice you heard, was it?" Dorothy pressed her lips together. "No," she admitted after a moment. "It was Dr. Haydock." The room seemed to grow quite still. Even Mrs. Bantry, usually quick with exclamations, was silent. Outside the window, Tobias flicked his tail once, sharply, as if punctuating the revelation. "You're quite certain?" Miss Marple asked quietly. "I'd swear it," Dorothy said. "He's always been kind to everyone, of course, but I'd recognize his voice anywhere. He was saying she had gone too far, that people were being hurt." She laughed at him, said he had profited as much as anyone. Miss Marple did not appear surprised. If anything, the confirmation seemed to settle some internal question. She had long suspected that whoever had helped Clara must be someone with access to confidential information, someone trusted by all classes, someone whose professional position allowed them to see human frailty naked and unguarded. A village doctor, for instance. Within the hour, Miss Marple had prevailed upon Inspector Slack to accompany her to Dr. Haydock's surgery. The inspector, though skeptical, could not entirely dismiss the accumulating threads. The dual pharmaceutical traces, the missing poison book page, the overheard argument, and now the revelation of Haydock's association with Clara's discreet financial advice. They found the doctor in his consulting room, preparing to make his afternoon rounds. His expression shifted almost imperceptibly when they entered together, the briefest flicker of irritation before his customary jovial mask settled back into place. "More questions, Inspector?" he asked lightly. "You'll have the whole village on bromides at this rate." "It is bromides I wanted to speak about," Miss Marple said, her tone mild. "And perhaps something rather stronger. You see, it appears that someone tore a page from Mr. Penfold's poison register some weeks ago, one relating, I believe, to a purchase made under a name that would never normally appear there." Dr. Haydock's eyes narrowed. "Are you accusing me of unauthorized purchases, Jane?" I have a medical practice to run. I require certain preparations." "Indeed," Miss Marple agreed. "But when those same preparations appear, in trace amounts, upon the clothing of a murdered woman, alongside a quite different sedative made by a frightened young man, one begins to wonder who exactly was managing whom." For the first time since the murder, the doctor looked genuinely discomposed. His gaze flickered toward the window, where Tobias had now settled on the sill outside, staring in with unnerving intensity. "Funny thing, cats," Miss Marple continued conversationally. "Tobias would not cross the threshold of that shed, you know, though he knew perfectly well something was wrong. Oh, he made a fuss, certainly, but from outside, almost as if he'd been shut in somewhere nearby earlier. Somewhere dark, confined, perhaps the surgery broom cupboard. Very inconvenient, having a watchful creature underfoot when one wishes to move about the vicarage unseen." And Haydock opened his mouth to protest, but the words did not quite arrive. Instead, there was a silence, small at first, then widening, like a crack spreading through glass. In that silence, Miss Marple knew she had reached some critical juncture, the moment when a carefully maintained facade met the implacable pressure of truth. The game, she realized, was at last moving into its final phase. Miss Marple did not press Dr. Haydock further that morning. She merely inclined her head, as though his indignant denial had entirely satisfied her, and allowed the conversation to drift into safer channels. But the slight tremor in his usually steady hands, the way his eyes avoided Dorothy's, and the faint sheen of perspiration on his brow had not escaped her. By late afternoon, word had spread that Miss Marple intended to assist Inspector Slack by arranging a small gathering at the vicarage to clarify certain misunderstandings. The phrase alone was enough to ensure attendance. In St. Mary Mead, nothing exerted such irresistible pull as the promise of misunderstandings about to be clarified. They assembled in the vicar's sitting room as the long summer light slanted in across the worn carpet. Colonel Melchett stood near the fireplace, arms folded. Mrs. Bantry settled herself with an air of avid expectation. Dorothy sat rigidly upright, hands clasped tightly in her lap. Geoffrey Ashford had been temporarily released under supervision, looking haggard but grimly composed. Haydock arrived last, his usual joviality forced, as though worn over tension like an ill-fitting coat. Inspector Slack was there too, though with a distinctly wary expression. He had been persuaded, more by Colonel Melchett than Miss Marple, to tolerate this informal reconstruction, though his muttered remarks about amateur theatricals suggested what he thought of the exercise. Miss Marple sat in her usual place by the window, knitting in her lap, Tobias curled neatly at her feet. The ginger cat had followed her in uninvited and installed himself with the air of one who had every right to be present. No one had the heart, or perhaps the courage, to remove him. "My dear friends," Miss Marple began gently, "we have all been very much distressed by poor Mrs. Ashford's death. There has been so much confusion, so many overlapping motives, that it is no wonder Inspector Slack has found the matter vexing." Slack snorted quietly, but did not contradict her. "I thought," she continued, "that if we went over events calmly, as they truly were, rather than as we each feared or hoped they might be, the truth might grow clearer. You see, I have come to believe that we have been looking at this from the wrong end entirely. Not from who might have wanted Mrs. Ashford dead, but from who most needed her alive and under control." A faint silence settled over the room. That angle had not occurred to most of them. Miss Marple's eyes rested first on Geoffrey Ashford. "You, Mr. Ashford, certainly had reason to resent your wife's hold over the purse strings, but your innocence is written all over your shoes. They were spotless yesterday. Too spotless for a man who had struggled with a body on a dusty potting shed floor. And there is your lamentable tendency toward panic when cornered. Murder, I fear, requires a steadier nerve." A faint, incredulous laugh escaped him, half relief, half disbelief. "Arthur," she turned to the vicar's nephew, "you prepared a sedative, believing you were helping a nervous woman. It was foolish, but not wicked. The more dangerous drug, the one traced to a commercial pharmaceutical, came from another hand altogether. Someone with professional access. Dr. T. Haydock shifted slightly in his chair. Tobias's ears flicked. "And Dorothy," Miss Marple said softly, "your scarf did indeed strangle Clara Ashford, but you did not place it in that shed. It was taken from your cedar chest by someone who had free run of the vicarage and knew exactly where you kept your most precious things. Someone who knew the presence of your initials would eventually come to light." Dorothy's eyes filled with tears, but there was relief there too. Someone believed her. Miss Marple lifted her knitting and, almost absent-mindedly, drew out the small, torn pharmaceutical label she had found behind the shed. "This, I think, belonged to the more dangerous preparation, the one that dulled Clara's senses before the scarf tightened. I fancy it once bore the full name of a London manufacturer, well known to any conscientious country doctor." Dr. Haydock's lips thinned. "If you are accusing me, Miss Marple, I suggest you do so plainly. I will not be toyed with like this." "I never toy, Doctor," she replied mildly. "I merely observe. For instance, I recall how very insistent you were early on that death occurred between 1:30 and 2:30. That interval happens to exclude yourself most conveniently, while including both Arthur and Mr. Ashford. And yet Dorothy heard your voice in the shed a few minutes before 2. "That girl is mistaken," he snapped. "People hear what they expect to hear." "Animals do not," Miss Marple said softly. Every eye followed her gaze down to Tobias, who had risen and was staring, unblinking, at Dr. Haydock. There was an odd, charged stillness in the room. Miss Marple's voice remained very gentle. "Tobias, you see, avoids people who handle him roughly. He scratches them once, then never goes near them again. But yesterday, when we all went to the shed, he would not go in. He sat just outside and cried. Not the cry of a cat discovering a body, that comes later, but the protest of one driven out of his accustomed place. I think, Doctor, that Tobias saw you in that shed, alone with Clara Ashford, before she died. I think you frightened him. At that moment, as if on cue, someone in the hallway dropped a metal tray. The sudden clatter shattered the taut silence. Tobias sprang, landing directly at Dr. Haydock's feet, and let out a long, harsh, accusing yowl that seemed to tear the quiet to pieces. Every face turned toward the doctor. His composure, so carefully maintained, cracked like thin ice. "You don't understand," he said hoarsely. "You don't understand what she would have done to this village, what she had already done. Someone had to stop her." Miss Marple did not move, nor did she yet speak the words they were all waiting to hear. The final pattern was nearly complete, but there were still a few stitches she needed to set in place before drawing the thread tight. "Perhaps," she said quietly, "you had better explain, Doctor. From the beginning." For a long moment, Dr. Haydock said nothing. The ticking of the vicarage clock grew impossibly loud, punctuating the silence as every eye fixed on him. When he finally spoke, his voice had lost its habitual joviality. It was flat, tired, and oddly older. "It began nearly 2 years ago," he said slowly. "Clara came to me as a patient. Nervous troubles," she said. "Insomnia, palpitations, vague anxieties. She was bored, of course. Bored and clever, and with far too much time on her hands. She noticed that I knew things, medical histories, past indiscretions people had confessed over the years." He gave a bitter smile. "She suggested we might do some good with that knowledge. Preventative medicine, she called it. If we quietly warned certain people, nudged them to be more careful, we might avert scandals, financial ruin, social disasters. It sounded almost benevolent." Dorothy flinched. Miss Marple noted the parallel with the younger woman's own recruitment. "But it changed," Dr. Haydock continued. "Clara discovered how much power such knowledge gave her. The warnings turned into demands. Money at first, then influence. Votes on the parish council, support for this cursed housing scheme. When I protested, she reminded me that I had been the first to break confidence. She kept a record. Names, dates, details. My handwriting and some of those medical notes. His hands clenched. She could have ruined me. Ruined my practice, my reputation. A village doctor lives or dies on trust. Inspector Slack cleared his throat. Get to the day of the murder, Doctor. Haydock stared at his hands, as if seeing them clearly for the first time. I decided to end it. Not the way it happened, no. I thought I could frighten her into stopping. I telephoned and told her I had discovered something devastating about Jeffrey's finances, enough to stop the development entirely. She was delighted. We arranged to meet at the potting shed. Neutral ground, she said. Fewer prying ears. You brought the pharmaceutical preparation? Miss Marple prompted gently. He nodded. A stronger sedative, liquid, easily absorbed. I meant to dose her tea. Yes, I brought tea too, to make it look like a friendly consultation. My plan was to let her fall into a deep, harmless sleep, then stage some sort of crisis, enough to convince her that continuing her schemes would put her under unbearable scrutiny. It was muddled, foolish, but I did not go there intending to kill her. Miss Marple's eyes remained kind, but terribly clear. Yet she died. She was already on edge when I arrived, Haydock said. Suspicious. She had received Arthur's mixture earlier, and joked about having options now if her husband became difficult. I warned her she was playing with fire, using drugs she didn't understand. She laughed it off. Then I told her I was finished, that I would no longer provide information, that if she ever mentioned my name, I would confront her publicly and deny everything. His voice hardened. She wasn't frightened. She was amused, said she no longer needed me. She had Dorothy, she had Ellen, she had her own clever little notebook, and then she showed me it. Pages of lives laid open, every sin and folly documented. She waved it at me like a trophy. Ellen made a choking sound. Dorothy buried her face in her hands. She said, the doctor continued hoarsely, "If I go down, doctor, I shall not go alone. Imagine what your patients would say if they knew how freely you discuss them. Imagine what your medical counsel would think." Then she named 3 cases. Old sins I had truly believed buried. She had details only I could have given her. I realized just how deeply I was entangled. He swallowed. I lost my temper. We struggled over the notebook. She tried to reach the door, shouting that she'd expose me that very afternoon. I grabbed her arm to stop her. There was a stool, some pots. She stumbled. The bottle in my bag smashed. The smell of valerian filled the shed. Tobias must have scented it later. That's why he kept returning. Miss Marple's eyes flickered with quiet satisfaction at the confirmation. I don't clearly remember the moment it turned from struggle to killing, he said dully. The scarf was already there. She'd brought it, not realizing it wasn't her own. She'd taken it from Dorothy's chest days earlier, said something about sentiment making people stupid. In the scuffle, it fell. I caught it without thinking, meaning only to hold her back. She struck me, scratched at my face. She screamed that she'd see me ruined. His hands rose, then fell heavily to his knees. And suddenly, the scarf was around her throat. She was smaller than she looked, thin under all that silk. It took so little force, far less than I would have imagined. Silence filled the room like water rising in a well. Afterwards, Inspector Slack asked tersely. I realized what I had done, Haydock said. I knew how it would look, money, blackmail, all of it. So I did what frightened men do. I lied. I arranged her hands to show restraint markings consistent with an attack from behind. I left the sedative bottle, knowing traces would mix with Arthur's simpler preparation and muddy the waters. I locked the door from the inside and left by the window, scraping my sleeve on the frame. He glanced at Miss Marple. Hence the soil smear and the wool thread. And Geoffrey? Miss Marple asked quietly. I knew Clara had arranged to meet him later, Haydock replied. She'd mentioned it, boasting about how she could make him dance to any tune. When he found the door locked and no answer, everyone would assume she was already dead, or soon afterwards. The obvious suspect with the obvious motive. He laughed once, a short, bitter sound. It almost worked, until that confounded cat. All eyes turned involuntarily toward Tobias, who sat on the sill, tail wrapped neatly around his paws, golden eyes bright and unblinking. "You see," Miss Marple said softly, "Tobias never entered the shed. His paws were quite clean." He meowed outside the door, not because he had seen the body, but because the window had been Haydock's usual way of slipping him little treats during his visits to the vicarage gardens. Cats remember kindness and smells. He smelled the broken sedative and familiar hand, sensed something terribly wrong, and cried until someone came. He drew us to the body too soon for the doctor's timing. We found inconsistencies before he could quietly discover it himself later, with a more convenient estimate of time of death. Inspector Slack straightened, his expression grim. "Dr. Leonard Haydock, I must caution you that anything further you say—" "No need," the doctor interrupted. "Jane has said it all, more neatly than I ever could. I killed Clara Ashford, not with forethought perhaps, but with full knowledge of the risk. And then I used every scrap of my medical skill and local knowledge to frame others rather than face my own guilt." He looked at Arthur, at Dorothy, at Geoffrey in turn. "For that, I am as much a criminal as any cold-blooded killer." Slack moved to his side. "You'll come with me now, Doctor." Haydock rose with surprising dignity. As he passed Miss Marple, he paused. "You always did understand people better than I ever did, Jane. I saw only symptoms. You saw causes. When they were gone, the room seemed to exhale." Geoffrey covered his face with his hands. Arthur put an arm, hesitant but sincere, around Dorothy's shoulders. Ellen stood quite still, as though awaiting a verdict. "It will be a 9 days' wonder in the village," Mrs. Bantry said at last, breaking the spell. "Our trusted doctor, and killed by a cat's meow, in a way." "Not killed," Miss Marple corrected gently, resuming her knitting. "Revealed." Tobias did what human conscience often fails to do. He made a fuss at the right moment and would not be ignored. Outside, the evening sun broke through the clouds, casting warm light over the vicarage garden. Life, with its small routines and quiet scandals, would continue in St. Mary Mead. Yet something fragile had been broken. The illusion that certain roles, certain professions guaranteed decency. Later, sitting alone by her cottage window with Tobias contentedly purring on her lap, he had, quite naturally, adopted the person who understood him best. Miss Marple reflected on the case. People, she thought, were much like her knitting. A dropped stitch here, a tangled thread there, and soon the whole pattern went awry. Clara Ashford had pulled at too many threads in other people's lives, never imagining that her own would be the one to unravel entirely. Haydock had begun with a small betrayal, just one broken confidence, and had ended with murder. "It so often starts with something quite small," she murmured, scratching Tobias behind the ears. "Just a tiny compromise, like feeding a cat under the table. Harmless, until one day he meows at precisely the wrong moment." Tobias blinked solemnly, as if in agreement, then closed his eyes and slept, his work as unwitting herald of justice complete. And in the quiet village of St. Mary Mead, the echoes of a cat's distressed cry at a potting shed door would linger far longer than any summer fete, reminding its inhabitants, as Miss Marple well knew, that human nature, left unchecked, could be as dangerous as any poison in a doctor's bag. In the days that followed Dr. Haydock's arrest, Mary Mead settled into a strained imitation of its former routine, like a village play in which all the actors were reciting their usual lines while still trembling from the real drama they had just witnessed. The shops opened at their customary hours, the postman made his rounds, and the church bells rang for morning and evensong. Yet beneath the surface, something fragile had been broken. Miss Marple observed it all from her cottage at the edge of the village, sitting by the window with her knitting and a teapot perpetually warming on the hearth. Tobias, having decided that her quiet company and unfailing supply of sauces were preferable to the vicarage's renewed bustle, had made himself thoroughly at home. He sprawled in sunlit patches, patrolled the garden wall, and occasionally regarded Miss Marple with a knowing expression that suggested he still considered himself the original discoverer of the crime. News, as it invariably did, had traveled quickly. Haydock had confessed fully at the station, corroborating almost precisely the reconstruction Miss Marple had offered in the vicarage sitting room. Geoffrey Ashford, released from suspicion, had left the village within days, quietly, without farewell calls or explanations. The planned housing development was abandoned. The meadowland would remain untouched, a silent legacy of Clara Ashford's unfinished schemes. It was Dorothy Fletcher who came to visit first. She arrived at Miss Marple's cottage one afternoon with a bunch of slightly wilted roses and an awkwardness that betrayed both gratitude and lingering guilt. "I keep thinking," Dorothy said as she sat, twisting her handkerchief, "that if I hadn't told Mrs. Ashford anything in the first place, if I hadn't believed all that nonsense about protecting people, none of this would have happened." Miss Marple poured tea with steady hands. "My dear, if it hadn't been you, it would have been someone else." Clara had a talent for finding people's weaknesses, just as certain weeds always find their way into the best-tended gardens. You were young and wanted to help. She was older and wanted to profit. The blame for what followed rests where it belongs. "But I still feel as though I helped load the gun," Dorothy murmured. Dr. Haydock said it began with him. "I suppose we both let ourselves believe that doing wrong for the right reasons was somehow less wrong." Miss Marple gave her a long, gentle look. "That is a very human mistake. We muddle ourselves dreadfully when we start grading sins like examination papers. Clara's misdeeds were spectacular. Yours were timid, fearful, and easily turned to better purpose once you realized the truth. You came forward. That is not nothing, you know." Dorothy managed a small smile. "Arthur says we should leave St. Mary Mead, start fresh somewhere no one knows any of this." "And do you wish to?" Miss Marple asked. The girl hesitated. "Part of me does, but another part feels that running away would mean letting what happened define us forever. The vicar says Christian forgiveness includes oneself, though he admits he's not very good at that part either." Miss Marple's eyes softened. "Well, my dear, villages have long memories for scandal, but they have equally long memories for kindness. You and Arthur will have many years to tilt the balance. Mary Mead is very good at growing things, gossip certainly, but also second chances." When Dorothy had gone, taking with her a cutting from Miss Marple's favorite rose bush as a promise of future growth, Mrs. Bantry arrived in her place, all brisk energy and righteous indignation. "I shall never forgive him," she declared, collapsing into the armchair Tobias had just vacated. "To think of all the times we trusted Dr. Haydock implicitly. I gave him my hydrangea cuttings, Jane. Hydrangea cuttings." "People come in layers," Miss Marple observed mildly. "A good doctor and a bad conspirator. A loyal friend and a frightened blackmailer. It is inconvenient, but there we are. Very few of us are simple sums of good and evil." Mrs. Bantry sniffed. "Well, I intend to transfer my hydrangea loyalties to someone more deserving. Perhaps that new young doctor from Much Benham. At least he's too newly arrived to have been mixed up in all this." They spent a companionable half-hour discussing plants and parish matters before Mrs. Bantry's curiosity resurfaced. "Jane, there is one thing I still can't quite fathom. Of all the clues, what truly set you on the right path? Was it the scarf, the pharmaceuticals, the telephone call?" Miss Marple smiled faintly. "None of those, to begin with. It was Tobias." "The cat," Mrs. Bantry exclaimed. "He told us the most important thing of all," Miss Marple said, "that the shed was not, to him, a place of fear after the murder, but of confusion and disturbance. He would not go inside. He remained at the door, crying. If the violence had happened in the moment he raised the alarm, he would have fled. But he returned again and again, puzzled by a familiar scent that no longer had its usual source. The valerian from the broken bottle, and its absence where he expected it, troubled him. Once I realized he associated that scent with Dr. Poole." "Haydock," Matters arranged themselves very neatly. Mrs. Bantry regarded Tobias with renewed respect. Then it really was the case solved by a cat's meow. By a cat's meow and a village's sins, Miss Marple corrected softly. Clara Ashford did not bring wickedness to St. Mary Mead. She merely stirred what was already there: fear, vanity, pride, desperation. Dr. Haydock believed he could perform a sort of moral surgery, cutting out the cancer by committing a greater crime. But one cannot heal a wound with poison. That evening, as the sun dipped behind the hedgerows and the village settled into its familiar twilight routine, Miss Marple sat by the open window, Tobias curled contentedly at her feet. The laughter of children drifted faintly from the lane, mingling with the distant chiming of the church clock and the rustle of leaves in the soft breeze. Life in St. Mary Mead would go on, altered, bruised, but not broken. Love affairs would blossom and falter. Small jealousies would flare and fade. Secrets would be kept and sometimes, when necessary, revealed. Human nature, Miss Marple reflected, was the only truly inexhaustible resource. She picked up her knitting once more, her fingers moving with tranquil assurance. Somewhere in the village, someone was no doubt beginning a fresh tangle of petty deceits and complicated motives. When those threads next tightened into something dangerous, she knew there would be signs. Small, easily overlooked, but unmistakable to anyone who had spent a lifetime watching. Human beings behave exactly like the roses and weeds in their gardens. And if all else failed, of course, there was always Tobias. Summer in St. Mary Mead gradually resumed its gentle rhythm, as if the village itself had drawn a long, shuddering breath and then exhaled. The vicarage lawn, scene of so much horror, hosted children's games once more. The potting shed, after much debate, was quietly dismantled and its timbers repurposed in the church hall. Only those who had been there that afternoon would ever glance, now and again, at the empty corner of the garden with a shadow in their eyes. Miss Marple, for her part, slipped back into her customary life with an ease that would have surprised anyone who did not know her well. Her roses needed pruning, the Women's Institute recipes needed testing, and her knitting basket contained, as always, more projects than could be reasonably completed before Christmas. Yet beneath these familiar pursuits ran a constant, clear-eyed awareness of what had occurred, a recognition that evil, in villages as in cities, seldom arrived as a stranger. One late afternoon, as the church bells marked the half-hour, Inspector Slack called at her cottage. He stood on the doorstep with the slightly stiff air of a man determined to say something he found faintly uncomfortable. "I won't stay," he said, when invited in, though he removed his hat and accepted a cup of tea with evident relief. "I merely thought you'd like to know, Miss Marple, that Dr. Haydock has given a full statement. It tallies with what you suggested, down to the telephone call and the stolen scarf." "I am glad," Miss Marple replied quietly. "A full confession is often the beginning of something like peace, even when no happy ending is possible." Slack took a careful sip. "You know," he went on, not quite meeting her eye, "when I first came to St. Mary Mead, I thought village folk were inclined to exaggerate your, abilities. But this case—" he cleared his throat. "Well, I will say this. You notice things the rest of us do not. It is only that human nature is so very much the same everywhere," Miss Marple answered. "A murder in a potting shed is not so different from unkindness in a drawing room. The pattern is merely rather more vivid." He gave a short, reluctant chuckle. "You and that cat," he added. "Never thought I'd see the day when a ginger Tom and an elderly lady made a better team than half the county force." "Tobias simply did what came naturally," Miss Marple said mildly. "He disliked the smell of violence, and he liked the smell of valerian. It was the contrast that was so very illuminating. Animals are often better witnesses than people. They do not explain away what they have seen." Slack finished his tea and rose to go. At the door he paused. "We'll keep an eye on the village, of course. After something like this, people lose confidence in professionals. in institutions, sometimes even in one another. And then, Miss Marple replied, time passes. People remember kindnesses along with betrayals. A broken bone, Inspector, can sometimes knit stronger than before, if it is set straight to begin with. He looked at her sharply, then nodded, as if recognizing a truth more solid than anything in his notebooks. Good afternoon, Miss Marple. After he had gone, the cottage seemed to exhale into its usual quiet. Tobias, who had been pretending indifference on the windowsill, jumped to Miss Marple's lap and settled himself with proprietary satisfaction. She stroked his fur absently, her mind turning once again to those involved. Dorothy and Arthur had decided to remain. Arthur, in a gesture that made the vicar both proud and anxious, had written to his former professors, explaining, in terms as honest as circumstances allowed, why he wished to resume his studies. Dorothy had taken on additional parish duties, her once timid voice now firm when she spoke of proper confidentiality and the dangers of misused knowledge. Geoffrey Ashford had written, from an anonymous hotel, a brief letter of thanks to Miss Marple. Enclosed was a bank draft made out to the parish for the general good of the village. The vicar, after some hesitation, had accepted it, directing the funds to relieve those worst injured by Clara's predations. No one spoke of the source, though most could guess. As for Dr. Haydock, his name was no longer spoken lightly. Yet, in private, Miss Marple sometimes recalled the man who had once sat in Mrs. Bantry's drawing room, laughing over some village absurdity, or who had brought medicine to sick children in the dead of winter without thought of payment. Good and evil, she knew, so often sat uncomfortably close together in the same human heart. One Sunday, after church, Mrs. Bantry remarked, "Do you know, Jane, what I find the most disturbing thing of all? That whole elaborate business with the sedatives and the scarf and the blackmail, it might almost have succeeded if you hadn't noticed a bit of wool and a cat's peculiar interest in a broken bottle." Miss Marple smiled faintly. "Oh, Dolly, it was never just the cat. It was Arthur's nervous watch, Dorothy's missing scarf, Ellen's half-remembered telephone call, Mr. Penfold's torn page, Colonel Melchett's indignation, even Mrs. Price Ridley's relish and scandal. People reveal more than they intend when they believe they are merely behaving as usual." Mrs. Bantry considered this. Yes, but still, a cat's meow did rather set the whole thing in motion. "That is quite true," Miss Marple agreed. "One must always pay attention when nature protests. Whether it is a rose wilting in an otherwise healthy bed, or a cat crying outside a closed door, there is generally something wrong that polite society has chosen not to notice." And the following week, the Summer Fete Committee met, somewhat soberly, to discuss whether future events should be simplified. In the end, they decided to continue much as before. Cakes would still be baked, coconuts still knocked from their stands, and raffle prizes still distributed amid excited chatter. Life, after all, had to be lived. On the day the first autumn leaf drifted lazily into Miss Marple's garden, she sat with her knitting and watched Tobias stalk an entirely imaginary threat among the asters. The case of Clara Ashford's murder seemed, to outside eyes, firmly concluded. Yet for Miss Marple it remained, like all such episodes, part of a larger pattern, another proof that beneath the lace doilies and village fates, human nature ran to the same old. Themes of fear, pride, greed, and, occasionally, redemption. She threaded a new length of yarn, soft, warm, and as yet untangled. "We must always listen, Tobias," she murmured, as the cat purred in agreeable ignorance. "To what is said and what is not said, to the silences and sometimes," her eyes twinkled, "to a cat's meow outside a potting shed." The church clock chimed the hour. Somewhere down the lane, a child laughed. Somewhere else, a kettle shrieked its domestic warning, "Sir." Merry Mead, with all its virtues and vices, its secrets and its small heroisms, went quietly on. And in a neat white cottage with a thatched roof and a small, well-tended garden, an elderly lady with sharp blue eyes and an unassuming manner sat serenely at her window, quite ready, if called upon, to notice once again what others preferred not to see.